Took 20
Woo!
We've also got
All right.
question and answer. Go
Question and answers.
ahead.
Go for it.
So what kind of big projects do you propose?
Well, as was hidden in an earlier version of my slides, malaria I think would be a great project for us to go after.
Ooh, yeah.
I mean, we've hit smallpox, which is I think pretty inspiring. Like the human civilization went after a big disease, and we're like, well, smallpox is terrible, and it probably doesn't exist anymore. If it exists, it's probably like, some renegade Soviet scientists are waiting to inflict it upon the universe again. But it may totally be removed from existence. I think that's really cool. Malaria, I think, would be great. It's this wonderful project where you could imagine, like, if you do it like the Manhattan Project and not like the Great Leap Forward, it involves tons of people. There's a lot of people who are just like, oh, malaria, you take this, here's a mosquito net, here's how you use it. Like, you, release these, terrible mosquitoes that outcompete the existing mosquitoes. I think it could be an excellent sort of big-scale project that we don't do anymore.
I've read that malaria came really close to being eradicated and just needed a little more funding, and no one would pony up that funding, and so then it came roaring back.
I had heard, but that's tragic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was more prevalent in Europe back in the day, and it's pretty much gone from Europe.
It's gone from a lot of places, but there's places where it's totally...
Yeah, but I mean,
We're coming back.
gone from the world like smallpox is
Right.
much better.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. But what I've read is there was a malaria eradication campaign, and it came very close to succeeding and failed for lack of financial cooperation.
Yeah, wow.
There's one question we left.
So, why did inferior steel cause so many deaths?
I don't think so. Perhaps that is incorrect as far as I know. I think what caused so many deaths was a bunch of things. Mismanagement, sort of poor decisions at the big level, and just bad weather caused a lot of it.
That's an understatement. A lot of people that were dissenters to the Mao's regime were killed forcibly.
But also,
Yeah.
but also, like, the idea that someone very far from a farm could say, here's what you guys should be growing because I know better, was fundamentally, I mean, they took away land rights from a lot of people, reorganized their entire social structure, moved people from where they were living, and put them in places where they didn't know their local land, and therefore were sort of left to farm with tools that they had never used before, or grains that they had never used before. Like there was a whole series of breakdowns in when you have a centralized government dictating what the individual peasant should be doing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily, the peasant should be able to look at their situation and say, what is the most economically advantageous thing for me to be growing right now so that I can feed my family, rather than a centralized government dictating that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's also part of the problem with the steel was that somebody at the central headquarters said, this is what we should be doing, whether or not there was anything to be using that steel for, or whether or not that would be economically make any sense.
Well, and one example of that is there's a lot of illogical things. So, like, for example, the government would go around and take people's steel pots and say, you don't need these, why you have so many pots? To increase production, they would melt those down. Oftentimes those pots were very high quality, but they were melted down and oftentimes later replaced with really crappy pots from inferior steel. People were encouraged to report if their neighbors weren't conforming to the mandates of the government. So, like, for example, people weren't supposed to have protein or chickens. Like, so if you had eggs, if you kept your eggs for yourself instead of giving them to the government, you could be put to death. And people, for example, there's allegories that I've heard of people standing outside of the windows of houses of people in town that they were suspicious of, and like smelling at the window to see if they could smell eggs, so they could have a reason to report them.
Because they were starving.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
large
yeah.
scale.
Jump in.
This conversation assumes that the deaths were accidental. If you put it in the context of other communist regimes, Stalin killed a lot of people, Pol Pot killed a lot of people. Read about communism in Greece; it's just murderous and genocide.
I'm not an expert in this field, or this topic.
Science.
That science didn't include that's just history. But the famine is like there were certainly people who were like, this is an enemy of Mao Zedong, and we're trying to get rid of him. And I think there were a lot of peasants who were dying. I just don't see a huge plausible reason that like we need to thin out the Chinese population.
One-child policy,
Word?
Right.
Word?
by other means.
Mm-hmm.
So, seems like what I was hearing, maybe you can correct me, is that you're sort of positing that for a large scale sort of collaborative project to work, you need to have it, rather than having like one sort of from on high dictating all of the details. You have
Mhm.
more of like a crowdsourcing style cooperation where you say, here's what the problems that I'm dealing with, and people are like, oh yeah, I can kind of work on that piece, rather than being more sort of micromanagey. Is that sort of what you were saying?
I'd be reluctant to make such a bold claim as that. But yeah, I mean, the couple of anecdotes that I shared were like the firemen being like, well, first they didn't work, and then I told them what they were doing, and they were great! And then like the Chinese like backyard steel furnaces where they were like, oh yeah, this is fine, except that they had no idea. So yeah, like the information flow down to the individuals who are cooperating, I think that
But
counts
do you
for
think
something.
it's an information flow thing, or do you think it's more of a sort of
Central
ownership
planning.
thing, and central planning versus distributed ownership?
I don't know. I'm not even sure I want to hazard a guess, just because I don't feel like I'm qualified to make a solid guess. I mean, any more than many amateurs in the world. But yeah, I was leaning toward information flow. But I am no expert.
I just wonder how you reconcile the concept of large-scale cooperation and the concept of nation-states.
Explain what you mean by nation states.
Just
countries.
countries.
Yeah.
But I mean, basically, the premise, if you take the successful example of creating the atomic bomb, is that governments agreed on that being a priority. If you take malaria,
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, we've got immigrants. Like, malaria is not our concern right now. I'm playing devil's advocate, obviously. And here you're just like, well, the Zika mosquito thing, it's in Latin America, it's not got to us yet, so we're not going to deal with it. So how do you reconcile that concept of humanity problems, like climate change, and
Yeah. I mean, my general feeling is that the conflict across countries has caused a lot of these great projects to happen, and it's certainly possible that people are just complacent now. And they're like, oh, well, I mean, absent any sort of impending doom from a rival, let's just all make our own worlds a little bit better and try and increase GDP and maybe try and see how many people we can get the iPhone, which is a little less inspiring than the sort of all right, everyone, a little sacrifice might be needed, but we're gonna do great things here. Shift what you were doing. The big goal is doubling steel output, or the big goal is nuclear weapons.
But here the big goal is to get together against someone, whereas
Right.
whereas malaria is a thing.
It's a
not
thing,
someone.
and it's and there. I think my rough feeling is there's not a lot of examples, sadly, of us doing that instead of against someone. Just I mean, the enemy is some it's not other humans. It's some inanimate virus.
Apollo program.
What about diabetes
But that
versus
was-
don't let it
That
die?
was a competition.
Kind of, but
That's
it was also an inspiring.
No,
Wait,
what?
wait,
What? I mean, what they did
That
in a
wasn't
short amount of time
necessarily
was crazy.
motivation.
Yeah.
That was insane.
Yeah.
We went to the moon in what, 20
Less than-
years or
I mean,
something?
we had there's
12 years
there's
from Sputnik.
AIDS, malaria, there's climate change. There are a number of examples of cancer,
Of us
of
being
things where
affected.
the world or portions of could have gotten together to try and be let's.
Yeah.
There's
So back just quickly.
just a comment. I think racism. That's all.
Yeah.
Alright,
We've got time
I
for
would
one
just-
last question.
Can I just say
Nobody wants-
could I let someone else ask a question and then have a plug at the end?
Yeah, I kind of. Well,
Sure.
there's good evidence that when it comes to the central planning is relatively effective when it comes to medical issues, and really bad evidence that it's effective when it comes to almost everything else.
I mean, the
Um,
Manhattan Project, there was a
Well,
contradiction
so-
to that. I
No,
it's like,
I would actually not put the Manhattan. That's a small team. That's not really centralized planning. That's a small team that yes had to work with one another, but you're not talking on the level of hundreds of thousands of people. Most of the
New
people there
Deal
was a
was pretty
small team. New Deal is a great
it
example.
was about 100,000, but yeah.
100,000.
Yeah.
Well, so
But not hundreds of thousands.
not hundreds
not,
of
not
thousands, not on the
millions.
scale of China,
Uh-huh.
right? And there are a few examples where we can do like infrastructure that works. That's like the roads that people go on, but not necessarily telling everybody what their main job should be.
Okay.
But medicine, I will say, is one that there's great evidence that we are able to do centralized planning that super works. And my question was, you picked the worst example of centralized planning.
The Great Leap Forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a bad. That was a
Yeah,
bad
so
situation.
I'm curious what you feel like the best example of centralized mission statement planning
I mean,
kind of thing is.
what I selected after a non-exhaustive research was the Manhattan Project. That was the sort of other pole of success in that its goals were like very well achieved. The goals were the nukes, but I feel like there's a lot of anecdotes of like, wow, this machine worked well. But I don't know. Do you have any other things that come to mind for like?
Somebody put
already
out
the
New
New
Deal.
I mean, the New Deal was
New
fantastic.
Deal is
That
a
was great.
good one.
Sure.
Although a lot of that was also distributed within the states that they were left to sort of manage, so breaking it down on smaller levels that I think made a lot of sense.
And also, I think that the New Deal didn't necessarily state like the goal, like a goal of we're going to increase, certain production, blah blah blah. It was more like we need to get we have these problems, right? We have infrastructure that's failing,
Yeah.
and we need to get people to work. So let's just do it. Here, let's infuse cash. So it wasn't so much like directed, like goal oriented in the same sense.
I agree. Did you have one last comment?
Comment less than more than a question, and it's the idea. I hear a lot of is it centralized planning or is it not? And I feel like there is room for the idea that it can be somewhat centralized planning with a lot of experimentation, tweaks for efficiency and for what makes sense on a local level, and that might be a better design for cooperation and one that's more effective that we didn't see in the Great Leap Forward, but we could see in something like the Manhattan Project maybe, or certainly the New Deal, or some of the other large-scale plans that seem to work.
I feel like I can add on to that, just that that in education we saw with the No Child Left Behind Act,
Right.
that was very much it felt very top down.
Yeah.
And
It
I
didn't
think
work.
part of the failures of that program
Is how controlled it tried to be.
had some people would say are because of how much it was dictated from the top, as
Right.
opposed to being something more like where you actually give control to the local school districts to figure out how they're going to raise their standards.
community needs?
Yeah,
Your
exactly.
community needs?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think one thing that maybe is the reason why a lot of the things that are successful, like the New Deal or like bridges, is because it's very easy for politicians to get political will for projects that will be large revenue and income generators for their constituents. So like if you build infrastructure, anytime you do that, you're going to be making a lot of people happy because they'll get rich off of it. Whereas things like curing disease are usually not profitable in terms of people making a good business off of it. On the current embodiment of that, you can see is alternative energy, and so like for example in 2014 the budget for alternative energy for wind and solar subsidies was around $19 billion, and so for that amount of money you could cure several diseases. There's kind of like an interesting aside. There's an economist at Oxford whose name is William McGaskill, and he is kind of one of the leading thinkers of this effective altruism movement, which kind of says from like more of a, I don't know if it's a libertarian perspective, but when we look at choosing things that are good projects for humanity, we should think about the net benefit, which is like how many people can we benefit and by how much. So I think that's just an interesting voice to listen to when thinking about some of these larger projects. And one of the things that I heard him talking about was with things like educational outcomes in developing countries, you see that certain different things that compare, such as giving more textbooks to classrooms or decreasing the student-to-teacher ratio, were actually much less effective than simple medical interventions on educational outcomes.
Yeah.
So, for example, like if you give students drugs that will remove parasites like worms, and you deworm them, they have a greater growth in their learning than if they have a textbook. So that's something that is really cheap. It costs 50 cents to buy the drugs to deworm a student, and it kind of seems like a really no-brainer that you want to provide that kind of healthcare to students.
All right.
Let's spread the
Super.
word.